At first glance, this photograph seems to show a woman receiving a haircut. But on closer inspection, her head is being shaved. For tens of thousands of French women at the end of the Second World War, this strange scene became their fate. But why did these disturbing events occur? And what legacy did they leave behind? This is the story of Les Tondues. Adolf Hitler's ambitions for European domination led him to target France early in the Second World War. After the swift conquest of Poland in 1939, Hitler turned his attention westward. On the 10th of May 1940, German forces launched a surprise invasion of France and the Low Countries. It took only 6 weeks for the German army to conquer France. The hardships of Nazi occupation led many people to collaborate in both large and small ways. Under the leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain, the Vichy government actively supported Nazi Germany, aiding the occupiers through political, military, and economic means. One of the most notorious aspects of this collaboration was Vichy France's involvement in the persecution of Jews and the Holocaust. French citizens collaborated in other ways, maintaining law and order, civil service, or trade. Some profited from the arrangement, while others complied out of fear. This included French women. Some worked as prostitutes, others entered romantic relationships with German soldiers, or worked in administrative roles to secure protection and rations. A far smaller number of people chose to resist against the Nazi regime and the Vichy government. When the Allies returned to France in 1944, they would lead immediate recriminations.
The D-Day landings in June 1944 would begin the liberation of France, with Paris and much of the rest of the country being freed by the end of August, although some pockets of resistance would remain until the final surrender of Germany in May 1945.
The liberation of France brought immense joy to the occupied French, with many lining the streets of towns and villages to welcome the roaring sound of Allied tanks.
We were then conquering heroes because the cheering crowds appeared again, and I remember that if you stopped your vehicle you were immediately pulled off, taken off to the nearest estaminet, and all sorts of drinks would appear on the counter. The soldiery was such, I think, that if the Germans had tried to come back, and they would have walked straight through because everyone was fast asleep having drunk so much. It was a wonderful time because it was such a contrast to Normandy.
However, with liberation came new challenges. France in 1944 was no exception.
The collapse of German occupation of France led to a period of lawlessness before a provisional French government could be established, which didn't happen until after the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Usually an Allied military government was set up in occupied countries, but the decision was made that France was to be treated as an ally. As a result, Allied officers collaborated with local authorities as opposed to acting as military governors. During this period of lawlessness, suspected German collaborators were targeted through a wave of executions, public humiliation, assaults and detentions. This became known as Opération Sauvage, or Wild Purge.
Meanwhile, the business of cleaning up the city has begun. Collaborators of all sorts, old and young, important and insignificant, they must be tried first. Here is one of the smaller rats of the town. Up you go, off to prison.
The Wild Purge was spontaneous and unofficial, often led by members of the French resistance as well as the wider French public. It took place across the country in villages, towns and cities, including Paris. Historians estimate there were over 10,000 executions across France during the Wild Purge. Some of these were French fascists or collaborators, including economic collaborators, informants and people associated with German soldiers. In the chaos of liberation, the Wild Purge was also used as an excuse to settle scores. Some actual collaborators even used it as a way of proving their allegiance to France. Some victims were not guilty of the crimes they had been accused, or had committed crimes that did not warrant the death penalty.
The Opération Sauvage was a period of chaos in the aftermath of France's liberation. However, one particular group became the primary targets of punishment, revealing how the period was not only defined by retribution, but also deeply marked by sexism and a rigid gender hierarchy.
In May 2025, IWM opened the first UK national exhibition about sexual violence and conflict. A key part of this exhibition is sexual humiliation in conflict, which is the act of shaming or dehumanising a victim through sexual violence or harassment. It is used to assert dominance and break morale, This often visibly marks victims and survivors, which can lead to discrimination and exclusion from society. A common part of oppression sauvage was the humiliation and shaming of women suspected of having relations with Germans, also known as horizontal collaboration. Approximately 20,000 women in France had their heads shaved following the country's liberation. These women were known as Les Tondues, meaning the shaved ones. These incidents were public events where crowds would gather to watch and jeer at the women before they were marched through their community. It was often accompanied by public beatings or other humiliation rituals, including marking their skin with swat stickers, using paint or even a hot iron. Some were executed.
A cart was being driven through the streets full of women with their heads shaven and the local populace jeering them. I think I made a remark then, and it still holds good, that these were the unfortunate ones, and I've no doubt that many a French lass had consorted with or had German boyfriends but hadn't been discovered. And I felt very sorry for these poor girls.
The occupation of one's country is often cited as one of the greatest humiliations and emasculating experiences for the population. Oppression sauvage was an opportunity for French men to reclaim their masculinity and take vengeance against Germany and its collaborators. The Vichy regime itself used gender to legitimise its authority by using images of Joan of Arc to promote pronatalism, which is the advocacy for increasing birth rates, as well as conservative family roles. French women taking German lovers were also viewed as a national betrayal and a further humiliation for French men. Shaving the heads of women therefore became symbolic to reclaiming France, men's masculinity and the female body from German occupation.
Les Tondues were often unfairly and indiscriminately punished. The trauma endured by those who suffered sexual violence at the hands of Nazi occupiers was disregarded. All the women were condemned and humiliated in the same demeaning manner.
Head shaving has historically been viewed as a sexual punishment, and it associates its victims with sexual crimes. It is now understood only about 42% of women who had their heads shaved in liberated France were accused of sexual collaboration. The other 58% were accused of other forms of collaboration but received the same punishment. Many of the collaborators were motivated by desperate circumstances, which had been created by the war in order to provide for themselves and their families. It included people who had served German soldiers as shopkeepers or domestic servants. Prostitutes were targeted, even if it was accepted their relationships with German soldiers had been professional and not political. Others had relationships with German soldiers and were attacked regardless of if there had been a sexual one or not. Women who had been victims of sexual violence from German soldiers were also included. Photographs of Les Tondues became some of the most iconic images of French liberation and became a symbol of wartime collaboration. The act was usually a very public event, and the presence of Allied army units that included cameramen, like the Army Film and Photographic Unit, and freelance photographers like Lee Miller meant the extensive photography of these events. Lee Miller would write about one of these incidents, saying, "I was kissed and congratulated, while victims were spat on and slapped." The IWM Sexual Violence in Conflict exhibition includes several of these images from our own collection and on loan from the Lee Miller archive. This image shows a woman surrounded by a crowd with a SWAT sticker sewn onto her clothes. She's holding a glass frame which contains several photographs. This may have been what the punishers regarded as the evidence of her crime. A few members of the crowd can be seen posing for the camera. Images like these contributed to building a myth of French collaboration being feminine and sexual. Passive femininity was used as an explanation for the weakness of a French nation-state during the Second World War. It has been suggested by historians and academics that it provided an excuse for Vichy cooperation with Nazi Germany in a way that reduced the shame of this legacy for men in France's national memory and placed it onto women. In the post-war period, resistance was viewed as national heroes. There are very few testimonials of Les Tondues experience to provide their own view of their own stories. Scholarly study of Les Tondues was virtually non-existent prior to the end of the 1980s. Thousands of photographs from the liberation became the only records we have of many of these women's experiences. As a result, the myth of women being punished for sexual collaboration and the way this symbolised French collaboration went unchallenged.
While Les Tondues has long been linked to France's liberation, the practice of publicly shaming women through forced head shaving was in fact a grim reality witnessed across many borders. This photograph shows accused female collaborators having their heads shaved in Belgium. They used the same punishment as France, and similar crowds can be seen in the image. Whilst this one shows the underground movement in Dawn, Holland, escorting a suspected collaborator after her hair was shaved. Other countries like Norway preferred punishments such as public exile, arrest, and other forms of discouragement. In 2018, the Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg publicly apologised to these women, saying that young Norwegian girls and women who had relations with German soldiers or were suspected of having them were victims of undignified treatment. The wartime relationships between French women and German soldiers, whether formed by choice or under coercion, led to the birth of a new generation. The Justice and Reconciliation section in the IWM's Unsilenced Sexual Violence in Conflict exhibition delves into the struggles and prejudices many mothers and children face in the aftermath of war.
As a result of the German occupation of France, an estimated number of 200,000 children were born to French women and German men. Some of these may have been the victims of sexual violence, but others were from legitimate, loving relationships. The end of German occupation left the majority of these children growing up fatherless, some of which won't have ever known who their father was. These children grew up stigmatised and with confused identities. The fathers were the enemy and their mothers were seen as the traitors. It wasn't until 2009 when France and Germany finally acknowledged its war children and started offering them dual citizenship, almost 70 years on from the children being born.
The story of Les Tondues continues to be striking and uncomfortable for both viewers and historians alike. However, the mythologization of the Allied victory in Europe and France's liberation has often overlooked the gendered violence suffered by these women.
National memory of the liberation in France continues to focus on the heroism of resistance and end of a traumatic and violent occupation. It's a moment of pride for France and its anniversary is celebrated each year. The images of Les Tondues and the gendered violence it represents remain difficult to reconcile with this narrative. It demonstrated that female victims were targeted due to the patriarchal social construction of a female traitor, and their punishment was motivated by masculinized ideals of nationalism. The war in Europe created a power imbalance, and women being put in a position of vulnerability. They had been made reliant on German soldiers for food, money, and security. The removal of German soldiers during liberation then made them vulnerable during the resulting lawlessness. It stands as an important lesson in how it is often the most vulnerable and not the most responsible who are punished.
The haunting images of Les Tondues act as a reminder that their sexual humiliation was not only deeply personal, but also a collective public spectacle, one that reflected the broader problem of gender hierarchy and the complexities of justice in the aftermath of war. These women's struggles, both in conflict and liberation, must be remembered.